Relax, it is just a car, my sister laughed, stepping over a piece of shattered fiberglass that used to be my front bumper. The thick, sweet smell of roasting coolant hung in the dark desert air, mixing with the sharp scent of deployed airbags. Beneath my shoes, broken safety glass ground into the asphalt. The crushed metal of my $135,000 Porsche popped and ticked as it cooled against the stone entrance wall of the Lake Pleasant community. At 39, as the director of compliance and operations for our family dealership, my entire job consisted of fixing other people's expensive mistakes. For 12 years, I had quietly cleaned up the financial and legal messes my family left behind. But standing there looking at the wreck, feeling the night wind cut through my coat, I decided I was done fixing hers. Your insurance will pay for it, Alyssa said, crossing her arms. She had barely a scratch on her, and that familiar, arrogant smile was already creeping back onto her face. I did not argue, and I did not raise my voice. I just pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the screen. The timestamp on my police report clearly showed I had reported the vehicle stolen nearly 2 hours before she drove it into a wall. The tow truck driver backed his rig toward the wreckage, the amber warning lights washing over us in slow, rhythmic sweeps. Alyssa shifted her weight, suddenly anxious, and stepped toward the man. She asked him, speaking far too quickly, if he was going to open the trunk before towing it away. I watched her hands tremble slightly. I noted the question, but I kept my mouth shut. 10 hours earlier, my day had started in complete, peaceful silence. I woke up in my own townhouse, miles away from my parents' massive estate. The low hum of the coffee maker was the only sound in the kitchen. Morning sunlight caught the dust motes dancing above an unopened box of Northline compliance business cards resting on my counter. I picked up my Porsche key, its cold, heavy metal grounding me, and walked over to my laptop. First, I checked my personal emergency fund. Safe. Then, I opened an email from my lawyer, Leah, confirming she had received the secure off-site copies I sent 2 days prior. Everything was in place. 3 weeks ago, my sister had taken my car without asking so she could shoot a social media video. I had sent her a text that same afternoon, clearly stating that she did not have permission to ever drive my vehicle again. I was not going to have another argument about boundaries, so I simply established the consequence. By late morning, I walked into the records room at Foster Motor Group. Rosa, our longtime service manager, nervously handed over 6 original consignment files. I reviewed the pages, noting the altered mileage logs and the heavily edited repair orders, before sliding the documents into a black canvas case. I pulled a blue tamper-evident seal through the zipper and locked it tight. My father, Martin, caught me in the hallway. He wore his usual custom suit and a polite, probing expression. He asked why I needed the original physical copies. I am reconciling some discrepancies, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. He smiled and let me pass, but I knew the building's automated system had already flagged the checkout. I carried the black case out to the manager's reserved garage, scanning my badge to enter the restricted area. The security camera in the corner blinked its steady red eye as I popped the trunk of my Porsche, placed the case inside, and locked it. My father had full access to those camera feeds, and I knew he would check them. I found out later exactly how my sister managed to get behind the wheel. Around late afternoon, Alyssa had complained to Martin that her rental car was not prestigious enough for a resort event she was attending in North Scottsdale. My father told her my Porsche was sitting in the manager's garage and would look much better for the family image. He handed her a temporary access code and told her exactly where to find a spare key inside the internal lockbox. He assured her I would not be needing the car that night. At the end of the workday, my phone vibrated against my desk. A notification from the vehicle's application flashed across the screen. The Porsche was moving. I logged into the garage camera feed just in time to see my empty parking spot. I picked up my phone, dialed her number, and waited. It went straight to voicemail. I typed out a text demanding she stop the car and return it immediately. A minute later, her reply came through. Stop being dramatic. I am borrowing it for one night. I did not call my mother to smooth things over. And I did not march into my father's office to beg for his intervention. Instead, I dialed the non-emergency police dispatch and reported an unauthorized taking of my vehicle, providing the license plate and confirming I had explicitly denied her permission. Then, I called my insurance company, which brought us back to the dark, quiet road near the lake. The tow driver was securing the winch to the crushed frame when Alyssa's phone rang. The wireless connection in the wrecked car was dead, so she answered on speaker. Martin's voice cut through the desert silence, tight and urgent. "Did you get the case?" Alyssa spun around, her eyes wide with panic. She looked at the crushed trunk, then at the tow driver, and finally at me. "They will not let me open it," she stammered, her voice pitching up. "Dad said it belongs to the dealership." I stared at her. The timeline clicked into place. The sudden change in her route away from the resort. The desperate rush to this isolated road. My father had not just given her a car for a party. I had never told Alyssa there was a black case in my trunk. But my father had. Heavy knocks echoed through the hallway. Morning sunlight cut across the polished floor of Alyssa's condominium complex. I stood a few feet back, holding a paper cup of coffee, watching as 2 uniformed officers waited at her front door. My sister finally opened it, wearing a silk robe, looking annoyed but perfectly composed. "Ma'am, we are here about the stolen Porsche," the taller officer said. Alyssa actually laughed. That practiced, camera-ready smile appeared instantly. She turned toward me, completely confident that 12 years of habit would kick in. I would smooth it over. I would tell the police it was a family misunderstanding, and we would all go home. "My sister is just upset about a little accident," Alyssa told them, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Tell them, Camille. I just borrowed it for the evening." The officer looked at me, his notebook open. "Is that true, miss? Did she have permission to take the vehicle?" My hands were perfectly steady around my coffee cup. "No, I did not give her permission." The smile vanished from my sister's face. Her jaw actually dropped, leaving her staring at me in total shock. The officers did not pull out handcuffs or make a dramatic arrest on the spot, as they needed to follow standard procedure. They simply stepped inside to take her official statement. Alyssa immediately tried to tell them I was making up the theft because I was angry about the crash. The detective noted the timestamp on my police report and shook his head. I had called dispatch 2 hours before she hit the stone wall. The timeline proved my sister was lying. By noon, the heavy wooden doors of my parents' estate closed behind me. The living room smelled of my mother's expensive floral perfume and brewing tension. Martin stood by the fireplace, adjusting his expensive watch. Elaine sat on the velvet sofa, wringing her hands, while Alyssa dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue in the corner. "You can end this with one sentence," my father said. He kept his voice low and reasonable, using the exact tone he saved for closing difficult business deals. "Just call the precinct and say there was a miscommunication about the keys." My mother leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Camille, please. We gave you a career for 12 years. Do not tear this family apart over a piece of metal." I did not sit down. I reached into my bag, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it on the glass coffee table. It was a printed copy of the text message I had sent Alyssa 3 weeks prior. "I warned her before," I said, watching my father's eyes flick toward the paper. "I reported the car missing before the crash. I am not changing the truth after the fact." Alyssa started to sob loudly, pressing her face into her hands. The golden child cried out that I wanted to see her in prison and that I was ruining her life over a stupid car. I felt absolutely nothing watching the performance. The coldness in my chest surprised me, but it was a massive relief. "If you need to discuss this further, send it in writing," I told them. I turned and walked out the front door, leaving the sound of my sister's fake tears behind me. An hour later, I sat across from my attorney. Leah possessed a quiet, clinical precision that always grounded my thoughts. I told her about the black case sitting inside the crushed trunk at the impound lot. The lawyer immediately began drafting a preservation letter. The police could not just casually rifle through corporate documents without a warrant or a subpoena, but Leah wanted an ironclad legal hold placed on the vehicle to prevent anyone else from accessing it. "Martin might try to accuse you of taking proprietary data," the attorney warned, looking over the rim of her glasses. I slid my own folder across her desk, It contained the inventory list and the time-stamped receipt showing Leah had received the secure off-site copies 2 days before the theft. I explained that I had only signed out original records tied to my official compliance duties, and I had not touched anything outside my legal authority. "Do not go back to the dealership alone," Leah advised, filing the document away in a locked drawer. The wisdom of that advice became clear by late afternoon. My phone buzzed with an update from my lawyer, revealing that the tow yard had just recorded a very interesting interaction on their security cameras. Alyssa had shown up at the lot, claiming she needed to retrieve prescription medication from the trunk. The yard attendant refused her entry. 30 minutes later, a dealership manager arrived on site. The man told the staff the case inside the Porsche was company property and demanded immediate access. The tow yard denied them both. The police hold prevented anyone from touching the wreck. My father was scrambling, sending his people to do his dirty work, and leaving a recorded trail of his panic in the process. Night fell, wrapping my townhouse in quiet safety. I was drinking a glass of water in the dark kitchen when my phone illuminated the counter. Leah was calling. During her police interview that morning, my sister had voluntarily handed over her phone to prove I was being vindictive. Instead, the detective found an exchange between Alyssa and Martin, and the contents had just been shared with my legal counsel. Leah read the transcript out loud. My father had sent the first message. "Take the black case from the trunk to the lake house. Do not return it to Camille." The lake house was our family property near Lake Pleasant, a solid hour drive from the resort my sister was supposed to attend. Alyssa had replied a minute later. "What is in it?" The final response from Martin sealed the entire timeline. "Nothing you need to know. Get it away from her." I set my glass down on the marble counter. The puzzle pieces locked together, forming a picture I had suspected but had not wanted to fully believe. The patriarch of our family had not just taken advantage of a stolen car. He had orchestrated a secondary theft while his daughter was behind the wheel. My sister had stolen my car. My father had tried to steal what was inside it. The fluorescent lights of the service department buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the concrete floor. Rosa stood near the diagnostic bays, gripping a manila folder so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The scent of motor oil and hot rubber hung heavily in the air. Leah and I walked toward her, keeping our steps measured and deliberate. We had exactly 1 hour before my corporate access was officially revoked, and we needed paper trails. Rosa silently handed over a specific maintenance file from 4 months prior. The printed invoice detailed a customer request for a spare key to my Porsche. I ran my finger over the signature line, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The authorization did not belong to me. A presidential override code sat quietly in the margin. A senior technician, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag, muttered that the president had requested a family emergency key. Before anyone else could notice our gathering, Rosa slid a photocopy of the work order directly into my legal pad. The security monitoring room was our next stop, tucked away behind the main showroom. Cooling fans hummed loudly from the server racks. Our lead information technology administrator nervously clicked his mouse, bringing up the digital access logs for the manager's reserved garage. The green text on the black screen told an undeniable story. At 10 in the morning, on the day of the crash, the president's account had logged into the garage camera feed. That view had stayed active precisely while the black canvas case went into my trunk. 7 hours later, that same account had generated a temporary access code for the internal lockbox. Leah instructed the administrator to secure the log according to the company preservation policy. The young man looked terrified, but he confirmed the system automatically recorded every keystroke, leaving an unalterable trail. My father thought he was severing my access to the truth by locking me out of the building. He was about 24 hours too late. The summons to the main conference room arrived 10 minutes later. The space smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee, thick with an artificial corporate calm. Martin sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. Elaine occupied the chair to his right, while the human resources manager shuffled documents nervously at the far end. A single piece of heavy company letterhead slid across the polished wood. Suspension pending investigation for the theft of proprietary business records. The patriarch folded his hands, his face a mask of disappointed authority. He demanded the immediate surrender of my laptop and security badge, along with a signed statement confirming Alyssa had permission to drive the Porsche. "You are throwing away your career," Martin warned, keeping his voice low and reasonable. "Sign the paper, Camille. Otherwise, you will never work in the luxury automotive sector in Arizona again." My mother reached out, her diamond rings clicking gently against the glass table. She begged me not to ruin the family legacy over a misunderstanding. I did not raise my voice, nor did I reach for a pen. I unclipped my plastic badge, letting it clatter onto the table next to the laptop, and pushed the unsigned confession back toward them. "Then put that threat in writing too," I said, looking right past my mother to meet his eyes. I turned around and walked out of the room, leaving 12 years of my life on that table. Afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor of my living room. The townhouse was silent, a stark contrast to the buzzing tension of the dealership. This space belonged entirely to me, bought and paid for without a single cent of foster money. I sat down at the kitchen counter and opened my personal laptop, navigating to my private banking portal. My emergency fund held enough cash to cover a year of basic living expenses. Next, I clicked into the folder labeled Northline Compliance. 2 small consulting contracts sat in the active directory, alongside an email inviting me to a corporate interview. Losing a massive portion of my identity hurt, leaving a dull ache behind my ribs, but the loss was not going to make me homeless. The small, unopened box of business cards still rested in the sunlight. Instead of putting the box away in a drawer, I moved it to the center of my desk. Night settled over the desert, bringing a sharp drop in temperature. My phone vibrated against the wood, displaying a call from my attorney. Leah spoke in her usual calm, measured cadence, confirming that the digital copies and the detailed inventory list I had sent her were completely secure. The metadata proved those files existed at her firm 2 full days before the crash. Martin could never successfully argue that I had fabricated the documents to cover up an accident. "I reviewed the system timestamps we pulled this morning," the lawyer added, paper rustling through the speaker. "Your father logged into the garage camera 5 minutes before he called the marketing office." I closed my eyes, letting the phone rest against my ear. The timeline arranged itself in my mind, sharp and irrefutable. First, the camera access to locate the exact position of the black case. Next, the generated code for the lockbox. Finally, the phone call sending his favorite daughter to the vehicle. My father had taken my sister's lifelong habit of taking what belonged to me and weaponized it. He needed that evidence gone, and he had used the perfect, unsuspecting camouflage to remove it from the property. He had not discovered Alyssa had taken my car. He had sent her to take it. Rosa stirred her black coffee for the 5th time, the metal spoon clinking nervously against the ceramic mug. We sat in a quiet corner booth of a diner, 2 towns over from the dealership. The air smelled of burnt toast and harsh industrial floor cleaner. The service manager slid a folded manila envelope across the sticky table. Her hands were shaking, the knuckles turning white against the brown paper. Inside sat copies of 3 different repair orders, printed before the system edits were finalized. "He made me change them," Rosa whispered. She kept glancing toward the diner entrance. The original tags clearly stated damage after private event. "Your father called me into his office and told me to re-enter them as transport damage. Camille, if I lose my job, my husband loses his health insurance. I cannot afford to be brave right now." I pushed my untouched water glass aside and placed my hand over her trembling fingers. "I am not asking you to burn with the company. I want to separate the people who followed orders from the man who gave them. You are protecting yourself by giving me this." Rosa let out a long breath, finally leaving the spoon in her cup, and nodded. 2 hours later, those altered repair orders sat spread out across Leah's mahogany desk. My attorney carefully cross-referenced the dates with our intake logs, while I pulled up social media posts I had meticulously archived 8 months ago. The pieces of my father's puzzle were finally clicking together, revealing a pattern much larger than my ruined vehicle. A silver Bentley belonging to a client had logged over 400 extra miles. During a weekend, it was supposed to be securely stored in our climate-controlled bay. Alyssa's social media feed showed her posing with that exact vehicle in front of the red rocks of Sedona on those precise dates. A pristine Range Rover appeared in the background of a charity gala photograph, despite the dealership software showing it waiting for a basic transport inspection. Leah put a former client on speakerphone to confirm another missing piece. A harsh, static-filled voice complained about receiving a consigned vehicle back with deep scratches and unexplained tire wear. The man explained how Martin had quietly reduced the final selling fee by $3,000 just to buy his silence. I pulled out a data export from my own physical files. The complaint had been manually changed in the system to read, resolved with no damage, erasing the incident entirely. The devastating financial reality crystallized that afternoon in the downtown office of Julian, the forensic accountant approved by our commercial lender. Because I was securely locked out of the company's servers, Julian worked strictly from bank statements legally provided by the lender after they initiated a formal review. The accountant mapped out the flow of cash with clinical precision, his pen tapping rhythmically against the heavy ledger. New customer deposits were sweeping directly into the operating account instead of holding in escrow. That incoming cash quietly paid for the secret repair bills on the damaged consignment cars Alyssa had taken out. Consequently, legitimate refunds to older clients were being constantly delayed, waiting for the next deposit to cover the gap. The mechanism clicked perfectly with a memory from 6 months prior. I had stood in my father's office, asking why a routine client refund was 2 full weeks late. Martin had quickly closed a banking tab on his monitor, claiming the lender was just slow processing the wire. The sudden speed of his hand on the mouse had bothered me enough to start keeping a private paper timeline. I had not suddenly become a brilliant investigator after a car crash. I had been watching the cracks form for nearly a year. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He explained that this was no longer merely sloppy bookkeeping or an aggressive marketing strategy. If the lender stopped funding the credit line, Foster Motor Group would immediately fail to cover its basic obligations. The entire family business survived on new money, quietly paying off old liabilities. I looked down at the final spreadsheet, feeling the crushing weight of 12 years of misplaced loyalty pressing against my chest. My mother always told me to protect our legacy, but there was no legacy left to protect. "What is the total rolling shortage?" Leah asked, her voice tight in the quiet room. Julian tapped the bottom line of the heavy paper stack. The missing money was not $20,000. It was nearly $680,000. My phone vibrated against the cold marble of the kitchen counter, shattering the morning silence of my townhouse. An audio file glowed on the glass screen, sent directly by Rosa from the dealership showroom floor. I pressed play, and the unmistakable acoustics of our main lobby filled the room. Martin spoke first, his voice echoing with practiced, grave disappointment. The patriarch informed the gathered sales staff that a disgruntled employee had stolen sensitive customer data in a malicious attempt to force a corporate buyout. My mother chimed in a moment later, her words trembling flawlessly as she described the profound heartbreak of a family betrayal. Finally, Alyssa addressed the crowd. My sister wore a soft medical neck brace, playing the traumatized survivor of a terrible accident caused by her cold, calculating older sibling. The narrative was perfectly constructed. Without my presence to counter the performance, dozens of innocent employees would undoubtedly believe every single word. The fallout reached the local community by lunch. Gossip spread through neighborhood social pages, spinning wild rumors about a jealous older sister reporting a minor traffic incident to the police just to collect an insurance payout. My email chimed with a polite but firm cancellation from a prospective Northline compliance client, stating they needed a consultant without public controversies. A hot, heavy pressure pushed against my ribs. My jaw ached from grinding my teeth. I desperately wanted to publish the altered repair orders and the bank statements for the entire town to read. Leah strictly forbade it during our midday phone call, warning that a public spectacle would completely destroy the integrity of our formal investigation. The price of a lawful defense meant swallowing the urge to scream. I typed out a single, sterile sentence on my professional webpage, stating simply that I would not comment on active legal reviews. Real consequences arrived late in the afternoon. A local detective called my personal number, speaking in a guarded, professional monotone. Martin had officially filed a complaint, accusing me of removing proprietary business records to extort the family company. My hands moved steadily across my keyboard, attaching my official job description and the signed chain of custody forms to a secure reply. I also forwarded the time-stamped email confirming my document transfer to legal counsel. The officer acknowledged the paperwork without clearing my name on the spot. Law enforcement moved slowly, methodically collecting pieces from two warring sides. The man who raised me was absolutely willing to turn me into a convicted criminal just to save his own reputation. The sheer depth of his panic became undeniable an hour later. Leah summoned me back to her firm just before 5 o'clock. The attorney slid a printed information technology server log across the polished mahogany table. According to the digital footprint, Martin had issued a direct command to purge the video archives for the manager garage. The system administrator had explicitly denied the request, citing the formal litigation hold Leah had established that morning. My father had subsequently labeled his command a routine storage cleanup, brushing off the failure. The timing, however, destroyed his casual excuse. The deletion attempt occurred exactly 23 minutes after the tow yard refused to let the dealership manager open the trunk of the wrecked Porsche. My lawyer stood up and walked over to her locked filing cabinet. The brass tumblers clicked loudly in the quiet room. She retrieved the heavy manila envelope I had delivered 2 days before the collision. A thick blue tamper seal remained perfectly intact across the flap. The attached digital metadata and the physical courier receipt provided an ironclad timeline. Nobody could accuse me of fabricating financial documents after a car crash when the raw evidence had been securely locked inside a law firm beforehand. A sudden, sharp laugh escaped my throat. The sound startled both of us, born not from joy, but from the absolute realization that Martin had profoundly underestimated my preparation. My emergency fund, outside contracts, and time-stamped legal files proved I had planned an exit long before the wreck. The sun sank below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the office floor, when my cellular phone rang again. The same detective from earlier in the day needed additional clarification. He confirmed Martin was aggressively pushing for a theft indictment. Then, the officer shifted his questioning entirely, asking if I had any knowledge of a spare key programmed for my vehicle. The two separate investigations were finally bleeding into one another. I looked at Leah, my pulse beating a slow, steady rhythm in my ears. I told the officer I possessed the original work order bearing a presidential approval code, and my attorney would deliver a certified copy in the morning. My father had not only accused me of betraying the family, he had asked the police to investigate me for theft. I slid the wooden closet door shut, sealing away a dozen silk blouses embroidered with the Foster Motor Group logo. The fabric rustled softly against the dark wood. For 12 years, that emblem had been my entire identity, and now it belonged to a life I could no longer access. I pulled a plain gray sweater over my head, feeling the soft cotton settle against my skin. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of my townhouse, illuminating the open laptop on my kitchen counter. A bright red banner stretched across the top of my health insurance portal, displaying a single word, inactive. My corporate email account had been completely disabled just after midnight, returning a sterile error message every time I tried to refresh the inbox. 2 former colleagues had already ignored my text messages, their silence speaking volumes about the success of my father's smear campaign. I logged into my personal banking dashboard and transferred the first month of private health coverage out of my emergency fund. Watching the balance drop brought a sharp, uncomfortable pressure to my chest. I was not infinitely wealthy, and losing a senior director salary meant my budget would shrink considerably. Still, the money in that account belonged entirely to me, and nobody could freeze it to force my compliance. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted my financial planning. I walked over and looked through the peephole, feeling my breath catch slightly in my throat. Elaine Foster stood on my front porch. My mother had never visited my townhouse before. She stepped inside with a hesitant, jerky motion, clutching her expensive leather handbag against her chest like a shield. Her eyes darted around the small living room, taking in the modest furniture and the absolute lack of luxury. She did not offer a greeting, and she did not ask how I was holding up. "The bank is going to take the house," Elaine said, her voice cracking on the final word. I pointed to a stool at the kitchen counter, but the older woman refused to sit. She stood trembling in the center of my living room, her floral perfume suddenly overwhelming the small space. Elaine explained that the family estate had been pledged as collateral for the main commercial credit line. If the lender recalled the loans because of the missing deposits, the bank would foreclose on the property. My mother did not apologize for Alyssa crashing my vehicle, nor did she acknowledge the theft. She simply demanded that I withdraw my evidence and stop the corporate investigation before she lost her home. "How many times did you sign loan documents without asking where the money actually went?" I asked her, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Her manicured fingers gripped the handle of her purse even tighter. "Your father told me he needed to leverage the equity to save the company. I signed what he put in front of me, Camille. I always assumed you would fix the accounts eventually." The sheer weight of her expectations settled heavily over the room. She knew about the financial holes, and she had simply waited for me to shovel the dirt back in. After Elaine finally left, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. The thought of my mother losing her home gnawed at the edges of my resolve, twisting into a familiar, suffocating guilt. I picked up my phone and called Leah, asking a question I immediately hated myself for speaking out loud. I asked if pulling my documentation would stop the lender from moving forward. My attorney answered with clinical, unwavering honesty. Withdrawing my files would not erase the massive shortage Julian had already identified in the operating accounts. Stopping my cooperation would only strip away my legal protections, leaving me completely vulnerable to Martin's theft accusations. More importantly, silencing the investigation would guarantee that the delayed customer refunds remained unpaid and the innocent employees lost their livelihoods. The image of Rosa stirring her black coffee flashed through my mind. The service manager had risked her husband's medical coverage to hand me those altered repair tickets. I could not abandon her just to protect a mansion built on stolen deposits. "I am not withdrawing anything," I told Leah, my voice steadying. "But if my mother needs a housing transition, I will help her find an independent financial advisor. I will not pay a single cent of that corporate debt." Leah agreed, noting that establishing that boundary was the only way to survive the coming wreckage. By early afternoon, I found myself sitting in Leah's downtown office again. The atmosphere in the room felt distinctly different this time, heavy with an unexpected shift in leverage. A man in a sharp gray suit sat across from us, representing my sister in her escalating criminal and civil liabilities. Alyssa had finally realized her golden child status offered no protection against prison time. According to her attorney, Martin had completely abandoned her after the crash. The patriarch had ordered her to take full responsibility for the stolen Porsche, demanding she tell the police that I had casually tossed her the keys. "My client is terrified," the lawyer explained, opening a thick leather briefcase. "She realizes now that her father intended to make her the sole scapegoat. She is willing to cooperate entirely with your timeline, provided you agree not to oppose a plea deal with the prosecutor." I looked at the attorney, feeling no pity for the young woman who had laughed at my ruined vehicle. Alyssa had still chosen to drive the car after receiving my explicit warning. She had still lied to the police officers on her front porch. "I will not promise blanket immunity," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "I will not tell the authorities to drop the charges. I will only confirm the exact truth on the record. Your client was manipulated by our father, but she still knew she did not have my permission to take that car." The man in the gray suit pressed his lips into a thin line, understanding that I was not going to play savior. He nodded slowly, accepting the compromise, and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a digital recording device, explaining that Alyssa had grown suspicious during a phone call with Martin right after the collision. Fearing she would be blamed for the missing black case, my sister had activated the recording function on her secondary business phone. The lawyer pressed a small silver button on the device. Static hissed for a brief second, followed by the unmistakable acoustics of a panicked phone call. Then Martin's voice came through the speaker. "Take the car." Camille always backs down. The sterile conference room felt like neutral territory in a war zone, smelling faintly of lemon polish and desperation. Alyssa sat across the table, no less scare, no longer radiating that curated confidence that once defined her social media presence. She looked small, her shoulders hunched inside an oversized sweater, and the faint bruises along her jawline stood out against her pale skin. She avoided my eyes, staring instead at the mahogany surface as if searching for an exit. "Dad lied to me," Alyssa whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I did not reach out to comfort her. I simply leaned back, keeping my posture rigid. He did. But you still took my car after I told you to return it. You had every chance to turn back before you hit that wall. The younger woman flinched. She started to explain how she had justified the theft, convincing herself I was just being difficult, but I cut her off. I was not there to litigate her moral compass. I needed facts. Alyssa eventually admitted that Martin had personally handed her the keys and assured her I had given my blessing. She had chosen her own reputation over my boundaries, right up until the moment her tires lost traction. I need the forensic copy of your phone, I said. Alyssa nodded and gestured for her attorney to push the drive across the table. Her primary device contained the entire digital history of the last 48 hours. The logs proved my father had called Alyssa precisely 7 minutes before she shifted her route toward the lake house. The mapping application confirmed she had been traveling at highway speeds for nearly 50 minutes along dark, unfamiliar roads before the accident. The data mapped out a sequence of frantic, hands-free arguments and hurried navigational corrections that directly preceded the final impact. My sister had been wrestling with the vehicle's controls and my father's impossible demands in the seconds before she slammed into the stone entrance. I stood up, feeling a cold, hollow victory settle in my stomach. Alyssa was not the mastermind, but she was a willing participant who had finally run out of runway. Our next stop was back at Leah's firm, where Rosa waited. The service manager clutched her handbag, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I led her into the conference room and ensured the door was shut tight. Rosa began to lay out the original repair order slips she had managed to copy before her own access was terminated. She detailed how Martin had personally threatened to replace her if she did not execute the entries he wanted. I listened to her describe the culture of fear he had cultivated, a system built on silencing anyone who dared to notice the disappearing money. I explained that the bank was evaluating an emergency trust, which could secure the payroll accounts if we successfully installed an independent manager. Rosa finally signed her formal statement, her hand shaking as she pressed the pen to the paper. I spent the next 3 days in a borrowed office, using the quiet to help the other employees navigate their own exits. I helped a junior mechanic polish his resume and verified pay stubs for the reception staff. I did not have the power to keep the dealership open, but I possessed the ability to ensure the innocent people trapped inside did not go down with the ship. One young assistant, who had previously been cold to me, walked over to my desk with tears in her eyes to apologize. I accepted her words with a curt nod. I did not need their friendship. I simply needed to finish the work. By the end of the week, the commercial lender finally convened an emergency control meeting over a secure video conference. The representatives on the screen looked clinical and unimpressed. Leah and Julian sat beside me, their posture prepared. Julian presented the findings on the $680,000 rolling shortage, outlining the extreme risk to the remaining client deposits. The lender representatives did not waste time with grandstanding. They immediately issued a mandate for an emergency control meeting and placed a strict hold on all outgoing capital transfers. A temporary escrow account was proposed to protect incoming deposits and prioritize employee wages and legitimate customer refunds. I sat in the silence of the room after the call ended, feeling the weight of the last few months finally beginning to lift. I had no illusions about the coming storm. The business would be dismantled, the family name would be dragged through the mud, and the man I once called my father would be forced to account for every single dollar he had embezzled. I leaned back, resting my head against the cool leather of the chair. The pieces were finally converging. Leah informed me that the final emergency meeting of the board would be held in the showroom on Monday afternoon. Martin firmly believed this meeting was his final chance to officially terminate me and recenter the narrative on Alyssa's incompetence. He had no idea I was coming back with the voice memo, the forensic phone logs, and an entire team of people he had tried to bury. Alyssa has agreed to appear, Leah said. She will testify to the commands he gave her. I nodded, my thoughts drifting to the cold, dark road. My sister was not acting out of a sudden change of heart. She was acting out of pure, unadulterated survival. She had realized that the man who had bought her every luxury car she ever desired was entirely willing to sacrifice her the moment her usefulness expired. I looked out the window at the setting sun, the orange light reflecting off the glass buildings. I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in my life, I was not working to save the dealership, nor was I working to rescue my family. I was working to close the loop on the damage. I thought about the independent life I had already begun building outside the dealership. I realized now that the box was already empty of its original purpose. I was no longer an employee trying to patch the leaks in a sinking ship. I was the one who had finally stopped sealing every leak they created. "Do you want to go home?" Leah asked. "No," I replied, standing up. "I want to go to the showroom. I want to make sure the evidence is organized perfectly for Monday. I want him to see it all. Every repair order, every mileage log, every message he sent to his daughter while she was driving toward the wall." I walked out of the office and into the cool evening air, my steps rhythmic and precise. The city was waking up, but I felt strangely removed from the frantic energy of the crowd. I was focused on the objective. I was focused on the truth. I could almost see Martin's face when he realized he had lost control of the board, the employees, and the narrative. He was a man who lived for the illusion of authority, and he was about to discover that his authority was only as real as the people who allowed him to hold it. I reached the parking garage and unlocked my vehicle. As I sat in the driver's seat, I allowed myself to breathe. My life had been defined by the mistakes of other people, by the chaos of my family's ambition, and by the relentless pressure to keep the Foster name pristine. All of that was about to disappear, replaced by something I had not even known I was looking for. I started the engine, the familiar vibration humming through my hands. I did not need the dealership. I did not need the approval of the people who had treated me like a safety net for 12 years. I just needed to ensure the people who had actually done the work were given a fair chance at a future. I pulled out onto the main road, the city lights blurring into long, colorful streaks. I turned the corner toward the showroom, my mind already running through the checklist for Monday. I had the records, I had the logs, I had the truth. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I was doing. I was finally free. The showroom floor smelled of floor wax and expensive leather, a sterile perfume that had defined my life for 12 years. I stepped through the glass doors at exactly noon. Martin sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, his back straight, his expression a practiced mask of wounded authority. Elaine occupied the chair beside him, her fingers fluttering nervously over her lap. Alyssa sat at the far end, looking at her hands. My father surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the human resources manager, the dealership counsel, and 2 stern representatives from the commercial lender. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs, and announced that we were here to finally address the unauthorized removal of proprietary company records by a disgruntled employee. He spoke with the cadence of a man giving a eulogy for someone who was still very much alive. Martin finished his prepared statement by pointing a manicured finger in my direction, declaring that my actions had put the entire business at risk. Leah, sitting to my left, simply tapped her pen against her legal pad. She did not raise her voice, but the sound cut through the silence. She asked Martin if he wanted to place that official accusation on the record, to which he firmly agreed. My father was so committed to the performance that he did not see the trap closing around him. The monitor mounted on the showroom wall flickered to life. I did not deliver a dramatic, emotional speech. Instead, I let the objective timeline speak for itself. I projected the security footage of the manager garage, showing Martin monitoring the camera feed while I locked the black case in my car. The room went dead silent as the work order for the spare key appeared next, bearing the president's authorization code. Martin began to flush, his composure fracturing, but he insisted that he had only been securing company assets against my suspicious behavior. "Take the black case." The voice recording filled the showroom, crisp and unmistakable. Martin's face turned a dangerous shade of purple as his own voice confirmed he had ordered my sister to remove the item while she was already driving my vehicle toward the wall. Alyssa finally looked up, her expression hardening with resentment. She explained that he had lied to her about my permission and instructed her to lie to the police. Martin snapped, calling her ungrateful, and in that single moment of uncontrolled rage, the patriarch destroyed the last shred of his credibility in front of the lender. Julian stepped forward to present the financial findings, detailing the mileage logs, social media evidence of personal use, and the systematic redirection of customer deposits to cover the service department's mounting debts. One of the lender representatives stood up, informing Martin that he was officially suspended from accessing all corporate accounts and digital infrastructure, effective immediately. The man was a ghost of a leader, standing at the head of a table where he no longer held the keys to anything. I walked toward the head of the table. Leah laid the inventory receipt on the table, proving the original documents were already in the possession of the law firm days before the crash. My father reached out to snatch the folder, but the outside business counsel intercepted his hand, gently moving the document out of his reach. The attempt to destroy the files had only served to prove his intent to hide the fraud. He stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant, realizing the empire he had built on deceit was dissolving in real time. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white. He whispered that I had destroyed the family, but the accusation carried no weight. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. No, I stopped destroying myself to protect it. Martin stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly, before he finally turned to leave. He walked past the staff who had spent years fearing his temper, past the lender who held the future of the dealership in a folder, and finally out the glass doors. For the first time in 12 years, my father left the building because someone else told him to. I remained standing at the head of the table, watching him disappear into the afternoon heat. I felt no rush of adrenaline, only a quiet, profound sense of closure. The long, exhausting work of protecting the Foster name was finally over. 8 months later, the empty showroom floor of what used to be Foster Motor Group echoed with the hollow sound of footsteps. The new owners, a group my lender had carefully vetted, were currently finalizing the transition of the physical assets. Every cent from the sale went directly into an escrow account, prioritizing the long list of customers waiting for their deposits and the loyal employees who had earned their final checks. Martin had lost all rights to the family name, and his influence over the building had vanished along with his ability to access the accounts. The legal proceedings moved at the agonizing pace of the state judicial system. Alyssa eventually accepted a plea deal, taking responsibility for the unauthorized vehicle use, the false police reports, and the repeated attempts to retrieve protected documents from the impound lot after the wreck. She received a sentence involving home detention, strict probation, and a schedule of restitution payments that would occupy her next few years. Her carefully curated social media persona collapsed almost instantly when her corporate sponsors dropped her contracts, leaving behind nothing but an empty profile. I observed the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, not with a sense of triumph, but with the flat, quiet neutrality of someone watching a storm pass. My father's trial spanned several grueling sessions. The bank records, the original repair orders Rosa had protected, and the voice memo recording formed a tightly documented case against him. When Martin finally stood for his sentencing, he attempted to paint himself as a visionary leader who had only bent the rules to save the business and support his workforce. A victim impact statement read by a retired school teacher who had lost her entire savings when her consigned car was wrecked and never paid for, silenced his defense entirely. The judge delivered a sentence of several years in a state facility, paired with an order for full restitution and a permanent lifetime ban from managing any business involving client funds. Leaving the courthouse that afternoon felt like stepping out of a dark room into blinding daylight. Elaine stood on the sidewalk, looking smaller than I had ever remembered her. The estate had been sold to cover the massive debts Martin had hidden behind the house deed. I arrived with a few boxes, not with a check to save her home, but with enough information to help her apply for a smaller, managed apartment suitable for her new, reduced budget. She looked at me, her eyes clouded with the familiar refusal to accept the reality of what her husband had done. "You are leaving your mother to live in this," Elaine whispered, gesturing toward the modest apartment complex. "You lost the house every single time you asked me to hide where the money came from," I answered, my voice steady. I felt no urge to justify my choice. A few weeks later, my phone pinged with a notification from a blocked number. Alyssa had reached out, her tone surprisingly devoid of its usual arrogance. She wrote that she had started her new job at a logistics firm that had nothing to do with luxury sales and was diligently paying back her portion of the restitution. She did not ask me to fix her mess, and she did not try to gaslight me about the past. She simply admitted that she had viewed everything I possessed as a resource rather than a person. I saved the message in a folder on my phone. I did not reply, and I did not feel the need to offer instant forgiveness. I simply kept the door to my own life locked. The final payoff arrived via a sterile letter from the insurance company, confirming my claim had been settled following their forensic investigation. I received a notice informing me that the subrogation department was actively pursuing Alyssa for the deductible and the cost of the destroyed Porsche. Alyssa called me one last time, her voice shaking with disbelief as she asked why they were still coming after her when I had already been paid by the insurer. I looked out at the late summer sunset, feeling a final piece of the heavy burden drop away. You were right, Alyssa. Insurance paid for the car. It just did not pay for what you actually did. I hung up the phone. For the first time, my sister finally understood that someone else paying the bill first did not mean she would never have to pay the cost herself. The warm light of early summer flooded into my small office, illuminating the dust motes dancing above my desk. A neat stack of files sat on the corner, all carefully organized according to the compliance standards I had spent over a decade perfecting. My own business cards, embossed with the name Northline Compliance, occupied a glass holder near the reception window. They were no longer just a dream tucked away in a cardboard box, but a tangible reality that belonged to me and nobody else. Rosa walked through the door carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee, her expression bright and professional. She had taken on the role of operations advisor for the consultancy, helping me design transparent management structures for small, family-owned businesses that wanted to avoid the toxic patterns I had once lived through. The office was modest, lacking the sweeping grandeur of the old dealership, but it was ours. It was quiet. It was honest. A potential client had called earlier that morning, asking if I would be willing to help them obfuscate a series of irregular ledger entries during an upcoming audit. I had declined the request within 10 seconds, feeling nothing but a profound, steady sense of satisfaction. I was not wealthy by the standards of my father, but I was debt-free and slept through the night. I did not need their money, and I certainly did not need the moral compromise. Later that afternoon, I met with a small group of the former dealership employees at a nearby cafe. We sat at a corner table, sharing updates on their new positions and career paths. One mechanic, who had worked under Martin for nearly 6 years, leaned across the table to thank me again for securing the personnel records. He told me that having a clean, verified history had allowed him to land a stable job at a larger firm within a week of the dealership closing. I nodded, offering a small, genuine smile. I had not saved the entire company, and I had not rescued everyone, but I had made sure the people who actually performed the work were not buried by the wreckage. The following week, I visited Elaine in her new apartment. The space was small, lacking the sprawling gardens and grand fireplaces of our former estate, but it was clean and well kept. My mother had started working with a financial advisor, slowly learning to manage a budget instead of waiting for a man to provide for her. As I unpacked a box of kitchen supplies, she told me she was starting to understand why I had walked away. She still spoke with a hint of melancholy, saying she thought she was keeping us together by turning a blind eye to the truth, but the desperation in her voice had vanished. I stood in the center of her small kitchen and explained that a family could only exist if it did not require one person to act as a permanent sacrifice. I promised to come over for lunch once a month, but I did not offer her a key to my townhouse, and I certainly did not offer access to my bank accounts. We were building something new, something that lived entirely outside the shadow of my father's lies. When the sun finally dipped toward the horizon, I left the office and walked out to the small parking lot where my new vehicle sat. It was another Porsche, purchased only after the insurance claim, litigation, and my business finances had fully stabilized. I touched the cool metal, feeling a sharp sense of ownership that had nothing to do with image or status. I checked the vehicle application on my phone, verifying that I was the only person with the digital key and that all access permissions were locked tight under my name. There was no spare key hidden in a back office, and there was no secret bypass code for someone else to use. It was just my car. I drove back toward my townhouse, the windows down to catch the cooling desert air. My phone buzzed in the cup holder with a non-urgent text from Elaine, just a small question about a grocery recipe we had discussed. I left the device in the holder, choosing to finish the drive in the peaceful silence of my own thoughts. I did not feel like a victim escaping a prison, and I did not feel like a vengeful conqueror standing over a fallen kingdom. I was simply a woman who had finally learned to differentiate her own responsibilities from the consequences of other people's greed. The engine purred as I pulled into the private driveway of my home. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the sound of wind rustling through the palm trees. I stepped out, walked to the front door, and took a deep breath. For 12 years, every time I sat behind the wheel, I had been waiting for the next crisis, the next demand, or the next emergency phone call from the people I was supposed to keep afloat. I had lived my entire adult life as a safety net for a man who did not care if I snapped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the single heavy key to my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt, stepped inside, and flipped on the light. The house was mine. The quiet was mine. I closed the door, knowing that I would never again be asked to hold the world together for anyone else. This time, there was only one key, and it was mine. The most difficult truth you will ever have to confront is that love, in its healthiest form, never demands that you lose yourself to save someone else. If you are currently standing in the shoes I once wore, constantly reinforcing the foundation of a family that only knows how to tear you down, you must understand that your loyalty has become your greatest liability. You were not born to be a permanent safety net for the people who refuse to build their own lives, and every time you step in to fix a mess that someone else created, you are effectively paying for their right to continue hurting you. True boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the necessary, sometimes painful, architectural requirements for your own survival. You must stop waiting for the people who benefit from your instability to suddenly develop the character required to respect your strength. They will not change because you are kind, and they will not appreciate your sacrifice until they have nothing left to take. Instead, recognize that the moment you choose to stop holding the world together for them, you are finally free to start building the life you were meant to have. You do not need to burn bridges to set yourself free. You only need to stop crossing them to reach people who have no intention of meeting you halfway. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to walk away from the people you have been conditioned to protect, but that fear is simply the feeling of your own life beginning to expand. Do not let your sense of duty become the prison that defines your existence. If you found yourself nodding along as I told my story, maybe it is time to ask yourself, what is the actual cost of the peace you are currently trading away for a family dynamic that leaves you empty? And what version of your own life are you missing while you are busy managing the chaos of someone else's?